The first thing anyone in Dusty Creek, Texas would tell a stranger about Theodore Carver was not that he was dangerous, or that he was cold, or even that he had once shot a man's hat clean off his head at 200 yards just to prove a point. They would tell you, with a kind of quiet reverence, that he simply could not be reached, and that more than one good soul had broken themselves trying. It was the year 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek sat along the western edge of the Texas hill country like a splinter under the skin of the earth, small enough to be forgotten by the railroads, large enough to have its own tragedies. The dust there was a particular shade of red-orange, the kind that stained boot leather and white linen alike, and the summer heat by late July could bend the horizon into something that looked like a fever dream. It was the sort of place where people either stayed because they had roots too deep to pull free, or because they had nowhere left to go. Theodore Carver belonged to both categories, though he would have denied either with the same flat, unreadable expression he gave to everything that dared to come too close. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were permanently rough from ranch work and a jaw that always looked slightly set, as though he were bracing against something only he could feel. His hair was dark, his eyes were the color of creek water in the shade, a strange mix of gray and green that people noticed but rarely spoke about. He had inherited his family's land, 400 acres of grazing pasture and hardscrabble scrub, when his parents had died within one season of each other. His mother to fever, his father to grief, which was its own kind of fever. That had been 3 years ago, and since then, Theodore had managed his ranch with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided the world would be kept at arm's length by sheer will alone. He employed 2 hands, a wiry older man named Pete Holloway, who had worked the Carver land since Theodore's father's time, and a younger fellow named Cisco Reyes, who had drifted up from south of the border 2 summers past and stayed, because Theodore paid fairly and never asked too many questions. Both of them had learned within their first weeks that their employer did not do dinner conversation, did not accept offers of whiskey from the saloon on payday, and had an absolute and non-negotiable habit of sitting alone on his front porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over his land with the expression of a man who was both grateful for it and a little destroyed by it. The people of Dusty Creek had tried. The preacher's wife had brought casseroles after his parents died. The widow Harmon from down the road had sent her son over with fresh bread every Sunday for 2 months. The sheriff, a heavyset and genuinely kind man named Amos Burke, had invited Theodore to the Cattlemen's Association meetings, the barn dances, the 4th of July celebration, the town council discussions about the new water rights dispute with the Hollies family 3 miles east. Theodore attended the things that were practical and skipped the things that required him to be a person in front of other people. He was not rude about it. He simply was not present in the way that mattered, and eventually people stopped pressing and settled instead into describing him the way they described certain kinds of weather: unavoidable, impossible to argue with, best to just work around. Ella Dawson arrived in Dusty Creek on a Tuesday morning in late July of 1878, which meant she arrived in the full throttle of Texas summer heat, on the back of a rented wagon from the stage stop in Cedar Ridge, sitting on her trunk with her hat tied under her chin, and her face turned into whatever breeze the motion of the wagon could manufacture. She was 26 years old, which the people of Dusty Creek would later consider quite respectable for a woman traveling alone, and she had the kind of face that was not immediately striking, but became more so the longer you looked: high cheekbones, dark brown eyes that saw things plainly, a mouth that was shaped for both laughing and saying difficult things with equal sincerity. She had come from Tennessee, originally, though she had spent the last 4 years in a small town in Missouri working as a seamstress, and after the shop owner died and left his wife destitute, briefly as a schoolteacher for a 1-room schoolhouse outside of Joplin. She had not been unhappy in Missouri exactly, but she had also not been anything close to settled. And when her mother's cousin had written to her in the spring with a letter that described Dusty Creek as a town, growing fast enough to need a proper dressmaker and seamstress. There had been a sewing shop there briefly run by a German woman who had moved on to San Antonio. Ella had looked at her small room above the post office in Missouri and made a decision that was more about reaching for something unknown than running from anything particular. She had $70 saved, a trunk full of fabrics and notions and the tools of her trade, and a letter of introduction from her mother's cousin, who was the wife of a dry goods merchant in Dusty Creek named Hector Prout. The Prouts had offered her a room in their house until she could establish herself, which Ella considered an extremely generous act from people she had never met, and she had written back with a gratitude that was genuine and precise and not at all overdone, which was very much her way of doing most things. The Prouts were good people. Margaret Prout was a round, energetic woman in her mid-40s who had opinions about everything, and delivered them with such warmth that they rarely landed like criticism. Hector was quieter, steady, a man who kept his word and expected others to do the same. Their house was full, with 2 children still at home, a teenage daughter named Clara and a younger boy named James, and a dog of indeterminate breed who slept on the porch and regarded Ella with deep suspicion for the first 3 days before deciding she was acceptable. Within the first week, Ella had walked every street in Dusty Creek, introduced herself to the necessary people, the preacher, the sheriff, the women who ran the various domestic operations of the town, and located an empty storefront 2 buildings down from the hardware store that Hector Prout confirmed could be rented at a reasonable rate. She was methodical without being cold, friendly without being performative, and the women of Dusty Creek, who had learned to be somewhat wary of newcomers by instinct, warmed to her in a gradual, organic way that felt more solid than the immediate enthusiasm that sometimes came with strangers. It was Margaret Prout who first mentioned Theodore Carver, about 5 days after Ella's arrival, over supper on a Thursday evening. "There is one thing I should mention," Margaret said, passing the corn bread with the cheerful gravity of a woman who enjoyed a good piece of information, about one of the largest ranches near town. Hector made a small sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a warning, and Margaret ignored it with the practiced ease of a long marriage. "Theodore Carver. His land runs along the northern creek edge, 400 acres give or take. His parents are gone 3 years now, both of them, and he runs the place with just Pete Holloway and that Ray's boy." She paused for the appropriate weight of this. "He used to come to town more regularly. He does not anymore. I'm not saying anything is wrong with the man. I believe he is simply the sort of man who has decided that other people are more trouble than they are worth, which is a terrible shame because he is actually quite well." "Margaret," Hector said mildly, "I am just saying that people have tried to include him and it has not gone anywhere useful, and I would not want Ella to take it personally if she encountered him and found him unresponsive. That is all I am saying." Ella considered this piece of information while she ate her beans. "Has anyone asked him what he actually needs?" She said. Margaret blinked. "Well, he does not seem to need anything that can be given." "That is usually the case with people who have decided not to need anything," Ella said, and the observation was so mild and so unperformed that it sat in the middle of the supper table for a moment without anyone knowing quite what to do with it. She did not think about Theodore Carver much after that conversation. Or rather, she thought about him only in the abstract way she thought about most things she had been told, filing the information away without assigning it excessive importance. She had a shop to establish, a life to build from scratch in a new place, and those were the things that occupied her days with the full, satisfying weight of concrete problems to be solved. She sewed. She ordered additional fabric through Hector's dry goods connections and a separate supply line from a larger merchant in San Antonio. She repaired the front of the storefront herself, cleaning the windows, painting the sign above the door in neat, simple letters that said Dawson Sewing and Alterations. She made it known that she could do practical work, mending, alterations, workwear reinforcement, as well as finer work, dress patterns, and the kind of careful needlework that took patience and a steady hand. By her third week in Dusty Creek, she had her first 6 customers, 2 of them ranch wives who needed winter coats let out, and 4 of them women who had been waiting for someone capable of making a dress that fit properly since the German woman had departed. She was good at her work in a way that was quietly exceptional. She had learned to sew from her grandmother, who had been a formal seamstress in Nashville before the war, and she had inherited both the skill and a certain philosophy about it. That a garment made well was a form of respect for the person wearing it. She held this belief without sentimentality, and it showed in everything she made. It was the last week of August, and the heat had only barely begun its reluctant retreat when Ella first saw Theodore Carver. She was standing outside her shop at the end of a long day, rolling her shoulders against the stiffness of hours at the sewing table, when he came down the main street on a dark bay horse with the economical bearing of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He was coming from the direction of the feed store, a delivery order presumably confirmed or settled, and he was heading back out of town without having stopped anywhere he was not required to stop. She noticed him the way you notice something that cuts a particular shape against the sky, not because you are looking for it, but because the shape is distinct enough to register. He did not look at her storefront. He did not look at much of anything except the road ahead of him and the far line of the hills to the north. His horse moved at a steady, unhurried walk, and Theodore Carver moved with it as though they were one continuous thing. And then he was past the shop, and the dust closed behind him, and that was all. Ella went back inside and finished the hem she had been working on. But she found herself noticing him again the following Thursday, when he came in for supplies and had a brief, functional exchange with old Jim Braddock at the hardware store. She could see them through the window from her work table, and the quality of his expression even in conversation was the same. Present for the necessary words, absent for everything else. Not unfriendly, she thought, just very far inside himself. It was Pete Holloway who came into her shop on a Friday in September, with a bundle of worn shirts that needed collars replaced, and 2 pairs of work trousers with the knees given out. He was a weathered man of about 60 with a permanent squint and a manner that suggested he had seen enough of the world to have developed very clear preferences about it. "These belong to the Carver Ranch," he said, setting the bundle on her counter. "Theodore Carver, you know the name." "I have heard it," she said. "He sent me in because he needed the work done and wasn't going to come himself," Pete said, with a small, resigned frankness that made Ella like him immediately. "He pays the same day the work is picked up. He's fair about that. What date should I have it ready by? 2 weeks would be fine. He's not in a hurry for anything except the horses and the cattle, and those don't need their collars replaced." She smiled at that, and Pete looked at her smile for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between assessment and something softer. The work took her 3 days, good, clean work, the kind she was proud of. She replaced the collars with a tightly woven cotton that would hold through hard use, and she reinforced the trouser knees with an interior patch that doubled the fabric's strength while remaining invisible from the outside. She was not thinking about Theodore Carver when she did this. She was thinking about the work. Pete came back with the payment on a Saturday, 12 days later, and counted out the coins with careful attention. He looked at the finished shirts and turned one collar over to examine the stitching. "That's better than he had before," he said. "It should hold for at least 2 seasons," she said. "I'll tell him," Pete said, and something in the way he said it suggested he thought this information might actually be received, which was more than most information directed at his employer managed. The weeks turned over with the comfortable rhythm of early fall in Texas, which was a gentler rhythm than summer had been, the evenings cooling, the light changing to something more golden and horizontal, the smell of the land shifting to dry grass and cedar, and the faint smoke of chimneys beginning to be used again. Ella's shop gained customers steadily. She began to know the town in the incremental, layered way that comes from being present in a place over time. The particular tensions between certain families, the unspoken histories, the small generosities that happened below the level of official notice. She also began to understand something about Dusty Creek that she had not been fully prepared for, which was the way certain realities of the time and place pressed on people in ways they did not always speak of directly. The land disputes were real and ongoing, and they fell harder on those who had fewer resources to fight them. She sewed shirts for 2 Apache men who came through town trading with Hector Prout, and she was struck by the way certain people in the town watched this transaction. The old territorial hostility, the condescension, the particular combination of fear and disdain that she recognized from other places and other kinds of people. She said nothing public about it, but she greeted those 2 men with the same directness and courtesy she gave everyone who came to her counter, and she thought about it afterward with a discomfort she had learned to take seriously in herself. It was early October when the first real thread between her life and Theodore Carver's was drawn. She had walked out to the creek road on a Sunday afternoon. She often walked on Sundays. It was how she thought through things, and had gone farther than she intended, drawn by the particular quality of the afternoon light over the hills, and had found herself, quite without planning it, at the fence line of the Carver ranch. She could see the farmhouse from the road, a solid, well-maintained structure, nothing ostentatious, with a long front porch running the full width of it and 2 mature cedar elms on the east side throwing long shadows across the yard. There was smoke from the chimney. In the distance, near the barn, she could see the shapes of men working. She stood at the fence for a moment, looking at the house with a kind of quiet appreciation, not covetousness, not any particular longing, just a recognition that someone had built something real here and had kept it real even through difficulty. Then she walked back the way she had come. She told nobody about this. There was nothing to tell. But she walked that road again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she found something calming about that particular stretch of the creek road, and the particular site of that ranch house solid against the hills. It was on the 4th Sunday walk that she came upon the incident that changed the shape of things. She was walking back toward town when she saw a horse standing alone beside the road, bridled but without a rider, its reins hanging loose and caught on a cedar branch. The horse was clearly distressed head high, nostrils wide, weight shifting, and Ella, who had grown up with horses on her parents' farm in Tennessee and knew their language fairly well, stopped and assessed the situation quickly. There was a figure lying in the long grass about 30 feet from the horse, partially hidden by the slope of the ditch. She moved toward the figure without hesitation and found a man, somewhat older, lying on his back with his eyes open and his face a bad color. It was Pete Holloway. "Mr. Holloway," she said, dropping to her knee beside him. "Are you hurt?" "My chest," he said, with the careful economy of someone trying to conserve something. "Came on sudden. Horse spooked at a snake and I went off, and then the chest." She recognized what she was looking at. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to the inside of his wrist. His pulse was there but unsteady. "I am going to get help," she said. "I am going to be quick. Do not try to get up." "Don't," he stopped, seemed to make a decision. "Go to the ranch. Carver needs to know." She was already moving. She reached the front gate of the Carver ranch at a pace that was just below a run, which was the fastest she could maintain on a Sunday dress, and pushed through without ceremony. Cisco Reyes was the one who saw her first, crossing the yard with a bucket, and he read her expression immediately. "What happened?" he said. "Your hand Pete Holloway, he's on the creek road about a 1/4 mile north. He came off his horse and he's having some kind of trouble with his chest. He needs help now and he needs to get somewhere that is not a ditch." Cisco set the bucket down and put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, sharp and carrying, the kind of signal that had a specific meaning, and in less than a minute Theodore Carver came out of the barn. He was closer now than she had ever seen him. He was even more contained in person, in the way that certain very large or very capable things are contained, not diminished, just concentrated. His eyes found Cisco first, then moved to her, and the assessment was rapid and complete. "Pete," she said, because she recognized a man who wanted information immediately and without preamble. "Creek Road, quarter-mile north, off his horse, chest trouble." He was already moving past her toward the corral where a saddled horse stood, and the economy of his movement, no wasted motion, no wasted seconds, was the thing she noticed. He did not tell her to wait or to leave or to do anything at all. He simply went. Cisco was right behind him. She walked back to the road. By the time she reached Pete Holloway again, Theodore had already arrived. He was down off his horse and crouched beside Pete in the grass, and the way he was holding the older man's hand, not formally, not awkwardly, but with a complete and unself-conscious steadiness, told her something important about him that no amount of town gossip could have conveyed. He was not unreachable with everyone. He was unreachable in groups, in the social performances of community, in the places where people needed him to be available for their comfort. He was not unreachable here, in the grass beside a man he had known since childhood, with the sky darkening and everything that mattered reduced to something simple and immediate. "Easy," he said, very quietly to Pete. "We've got you." Cisco had a flat board from the back of a wagon, had thought of it faster than anyone else would have, and between the two of them they got Pete Holloway onto it with a careful efficiency that spoke of men accustomed to physical problem-solving. They loaded him into the wagon bed with a folded blanket under his head. Theodore stood up then and looked at Ella. "You found him," he said. "Yes." "You came to the ranch." "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment, and she met it straight, and she thought she saw something shift very slightly in his expression. Not warming exactly, but a small opening, like a window that had been closed for years being moved an inch off the latch. "Thank you," he said, and the words were plain and real. "Of course," she said, equally plain, and that was all of it. He climbed up to the wagon seat and Cisco took the horses and they went, and Ella walked back to town. Pete Holloway was looked at by the doctor, a capable man named Dr. Fielding who had come out to Dusty Creek from Ohio 6 years earlier and had become essential in the way that good doctors always do, and was told he had a bad heart rhythm that needed rest and care and the complete absence of hard physical labor for the foreseeable future. He would survive. He would need to change how he lived, but he would survive. The next morning, a Monday, Ella was at her work table at 8 in the morning when she heard boots on the plank walk outside her shop and then a knock at her open door. She looked up. Theodore Carver stood in her doorway. He had his hat in his hand, which was the first thing she noticed, because it was the posture of someone who had decided to be somewhere deliberately and with intention, and she recognized that it must have cost him something to come. "I wanted to ask," he said, "what you would charge to mend some more of Pete's things. He'll be at the ranch, he's got a room there, and he won't be working for a while. I'd like to keep him comfortable." She looked at him steadily. "I can do that, whatever he needs. I'll have Cisco bring them by." A pause. He did not move toward the door to leave. "How is he this morning?" she asked, something in his face, not quite a softening but a release of some held tension. "Resting, angry about resting. Dr. Fielding says that's a good sign." "It usually is," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He left. She watched through her window as he walked back up the street to where his horse was tied and rode out of town, and she had the strange and involuntary thought that he looked lonely in the specific way that a house looks lonely when no lights are burning in it, not because something is wrong with the house, but because it was built for something that is no longer there. She went back to her work. She did not think about him excessively. She was not built for excessive thinking about men who had not made themselves available for thinking about. But she was honest, and she was perceptive, and she let herself acknowledge that there was something in Theodore Carver that interested her, not in a romantic sense yet, but in the way that a complicated problem interests someone who is good at solving things, except that it was less like a problem and more like a question that was being asked without being spoken. It was the middle of October when the Pruitts informed her that a small house 2 streets over from the shop had become available for rent. A previous occupant had moved to Austin, and would she like to look at it? The house was small, 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen, a porch that faced east, but it was solid and it was hers, and she moved in within the week with her trunk and her sewing supplies and the small accumulation of things that were beginning to feel like the start of a life. She put a rocking chair on the porch immediately. She had found it at the back of Hector Pruitt's storeroom, old but sturdy, and had paid a small amount for it and brought it home on the back of a borrowed handcart. She sat in it in the evenings after work, watching the light change on the street, drinking coffee when there was time for it. She was a woman who was comfortable being alone, which was different from being lonely. She had spent years cultivating this distinction between the ache of isolation and the quiet of solitude, and she knew the difference in her body, the way you know the difference between hunger and thirst. She was not lonely in Dusty Creek. She was present in a place that was becoming real to her, and she found that satisfying in a way that nothing temporary ever was. She thought sometimes in those evening hours about Pete Holloway's words when she'd found him in the ditch, "Carver needs to know," and the particular way he had said it. Not "go get help," not "someone needs to come." He had named who needed to know, and the name had been said with the certainty of someone who understood that one specific person's presence was the one that mattered. She thought there was a whole world of history in that, and she thought it said something true about Theodore Carver, that the people who knew him best still ran to him. She did not see him again until late October. He came into her shop alone that time, without Cisco as intermediary, carrying a jacket that had a torn lining and a sleeve seam that had given out. "Cisco told me Pete's things came out well," he said, setting the jacket on the counter. "They did. The reinforcement should hold." He looked at the jacket. "This needs, I can see what it needs," she said, not unkindly. "Leave it with me, I'll have it ready by Thursday." He looked up at her then. It was the first time he had really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to trust them with something, which was a different kind of looking than the practical assessment he'd given her the day at the ranch. "You're from Tennessee," he said. "Yes, originally. My mother was from Tennessee, outside of Nashville." "I'm from closer to Memphis," she said. "Different country, really." Something in his expression, not a smile but the distant relative of one. She always said that. She held his gaze without pressure, without the particular eagerness that she had noticed unsettled him in other people, the leaning forward, the wanting him to open, the performing of warmth in hopes of receiving it back. She was just there, comfortable in the space between them, asking nothing. He nodded once, the same way he had nodded before, and left. She picked up the jacket and looked at it. Good wool, well worn, maintained with a care that spoke of someone who valued what he had and did not waste it. The torn lining was a simple repair. The sleeve seam was more interesting. The thread had been the wrong weight for the fabric from the original making, and that was why it had given out. She replaced it with the right thread and the right stitch length and did the lining with a light, careful hand. When he came back on Thursday, he looked at the work the same way Pete had, turning the sleeve to check the seam, looking at the lining's edge. "You knew what the problem was," he said. "Wrong thread weight on the original." "That's what I thought," he said. "It won't go again," she said. He paid her, he left. But she noticed that he walked more slowly back to his horse than he had on his previous visits, and she noticed that he glanced back once at her shop window before he mounted and rode out, and she let herself simply notice this without doing anything about it. The thing that happened next was not planned by either of them, but it was the thing that made everything that came after possible. It was the first Thursday of November, and there had been an early cold snap that had brought the temperature down sharply overnight, and sent people scrambling for the heavier coats they had stored away in the optimism of September. Ella's shop had been busy all morning with requests for coat repairs and alterations, and by the time the afternoon came, she had a headache from close work and the smell of the sizing on the new wool fabric she'd been cutting, and she decided to close the shop an hour early and walk. She walked the creek road because she had come to love it, and because the cold had made the light on the hills very clear, and the cedar trees stood out against it with a particular sharpness. She walked past the fence line of the Carver ranch, as she always did, and this time she did not quite decide to. It happened in the way that things happen when you stop overthinking them. She turned at the gate and walked up the lane toward the ranch house. She told herself, if asked, that she was going to inquire after Pete Holloway, which was true. But she also just went. The porch was empty. The house was quiet except for the smoke from the chimney and the sound of the wind in the cedar elms. She went up the steps and knocked on the door and waited. No one came. She knocked again, still nothing. She could hear faintly from the direction of the barn the sound of work, someone moving, a horse shifting weight, the metallic clang of a tool. They were out in the yard, not in the house. She could have walked to the barn. She could have called out. Instead, she did the thing that she could not fully explain but felt absolutely right. She went to the rocking chair at the far end of the porch, the one that was worn smooth from regular use and had a cracked left arm that had been repaired with leather lacing, and she sat down in it. She sat there. She was not trying to surprise anyone. She was not staging anything. She simply sat in the chair, with her hands in her lap and the cold air against her face, and the sound of the cedar elms moving in the wind, and she looked out at the hills the way she imagined he must look at them in the evenings, and she found that it was very beautiful. She sat for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she heard boots on the ground around the side of the house, and she looked over to see Theodore Carver coming from the direction of the barn with his jacket on and his hat pulled low against the wind. He stopped when he saw her. She did not stand up. She did not explain herself. He stood there looking at her for a moment, and she looked back, and the whole particular strangeness of it. A woman he barely knew sitting in his rocking chair on his porch with the composure of someone who had been invited seemed to move through his expression in real time, a series of things she couldn't fully name. "Miss Dawson," he said. "Mr. Carver," she said, a beat. "I knocked," she said. "No one answered. I thought I would wait. You could have come to the barn." "I could have," she agreed. "But it seemed like a nice porch to sit on." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He laughed. It was brief, barely more than a sound, but it was real. He crossed the porch and leaned against the railing across from her with the careful ease of a man recalibrating a situation he hadn't prepared for. "I came to ask after Pete," she said, "and to bring this." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small paper packet. "Dried chamomile and some hyssop. The doctor in my mother's town swore by hyssop tea for heart trouble. It may be nothing, but it cost me nothing to bring it." He took the packet with the same gravity he gave everything. "I'll make sure he gets it." "I also," she said, and then she paused, not because she was uncertain but because she wanted to say the next thing correctly, wanted to say that "I think you are doing right by him, keeping him on at the ranch while he heals. It matters to him." Theodore looked at the hills. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "He's been on this land longer than I have," he said. "Where else would he go?" "Exactly," she said, and her tone was warm enough that he looked back at her. And this time the look was different again, longer, more direct, the kind of looking that is an acknowledgement of a person rather than an assessment of a situation. "You could come in," he said. "It's cold." "I'm warm enough," she said, "unless you want company." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, and she understood this was a considerable admission, "I wouldn't object to it." She followed him inside. The house was exactly what she expected: clean, functional, deeply personal in its absence of ornamentation. A fireplace with a good fire going. A table with books, she noted this. She had not expected it. A few photographs on the mantel. His parents, she guessed, by the way they sat in the frame like people who had expected to be looked at forever. He made coffee with the simple, practiced motion of a man who made coffee alone every day. He set a cup in front of her at the table and sat down across from her with his own. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He considered this honestly. "Someone trying to get something." "I already have my shop," she said, "and a house, and 6 regular customers. What would I be trying to get?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair point." They talked for an hour. It was not a grand or dramatic conversation. They talked about Tennessee, his mother's memories of it, her own childhood near Memphis, the way the land there was different from Texas but had its own beauty. They talked about the ranch. She asked practical questions, and he answered them with the care he gave things he knew well, and she could see him relax incrementally as the conversation moved into ground he was comfortable with. They talked about Dusty Creek. She mentioned the water rights dispute, and he knew more about it than she did, and he explained the history of the Hollies family and the original creek claims with a precision that suggested he had been thinking about it carefully for a while. He did not ask her personal questions, not because he wasn't curious, but because she understood correctly that he would need to be trusted before he could be curious out loud. She answered the questions he didn't ask anyway, folding information about herself into the conversation in the same easy way she laid fabric flat before cutting. No drama, just the thing placed where it needed to be. When she stood to leave, he stood too. "I'll walk you to the road," he said. "You don't have to." "The dark comes quick now," he said, and picked up a lantern. They walked down the lane in the early dark, the lantern throwing its small, steady circle of light, the cold air carrying the smell of cedar smoke and the distant sweetness of dry grass. And when they reached the gate, she turned to say good night and found him looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for just a moment, open, a little uncertain, more human than anything she had seen in him yet. "Thank you for the tea," he said. "For Pete." "Any time," she said, and meant it. She walked back to town in the dark and did not try to name what was happening, because naming things too early was how you broke them. She came back the following Sunday. She did not knock this time. She simply went up to the porch and sat down in the same chair. It was cold enough that she wore her wool coat and her gloves, and she brought her knitting. She was making a scarf for Clara Pruitt's Christmas gift, and she sat and knitted while the wind moved through the cedar elms and the smoke curled up from the chimney. This time, he knew she was there before he came around the side of the house. She heard his boots stop and then keep coming, and he came up the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee already in his hands. He sat down in the other chair. She looked up from her knitting, looked at the coffee, looked at him. "You heard me come up the lane," she said. "Cisco mentioned you'd been to the shop twice this week," he said, and handed her the cup. She took it. "That is a very indirect way of saying you were expecting me." "I wasn't expecting you," he said firmly. "All right," she said, entirely untroubled, and went back to her knitting. He drank his coffee. She knitted. The silence between them was not empty. It had the particular quality of a silence between 2 people who have decided, without discussion, that they do not need to fill every moment with words. After a while he said, "What are you making?" "A scarf for Clara Pruitt for Christmas." "Her birthday is in December too," he said. She glanced at him. "You know the Pruitt children?" "I've known Hector Pruitt for 10 years. His kids were small when I first started going to his store." "You don't attend the town events?" "That doesn't mean I don't know people," he said, and there was something slightly defensive in it, and then a pause in which he seemed to recognize the defensiveness, and then something that was nearly a rueful expression. "I know most of the people in this town. I just find large gatherings." He stopped. "Loud," she offered. "Yes," he said, "that, and other things." "Demanding," she said. "People want you to be performing yourself for them." He looked at her sharply. "Yes, that's exactly it." "I understand that," she said. "You seem to manage it fine." "I manage it," she said. "I don't always love it. I'm good at people one at a time. Groups are harder." She paused. "I think I'm better at listening than performing." "That's obvious," he said, and then stopped, as though he had said something he hadn't meant to say out loud, and she kept her eyes on her knitting so he would not feel watched while he decided what to do with the fact that he had just offered her a genuine observation. "That's not a criticism," he said after a moment. "I know," she said. "I took it as a compliment." The afternoon stretched out around them, cold and golden and very quiet. At one point Pete Holloway appeared at the far end of the porch, bundled in a blanket, and looked at the two of them sitting there with an expression that was deeply satisfied in the way that old men's expressions sometimes are when something they have been hoping for seems to be occurring. "Miss Dawson," he said by way of greeting. "Mr. Holloway, how are you feeling?" "Better than I have a right to be," he said. "Theodore, she made this tea that's actually tolerable." "I'm glad," she said. Pete stood for a moment longer, taking in the scene with undisguised pleasure, and then went back inside without requiring anything from either of them, which was, Ella thought, the act of a genuinely wise man. November deepened and the Sundays became a rhythm. She came, she sat, he made coffee, they talked or were quiet in roughly equal measure. He began to tell her things about the ranch, about his parents, about the years before they died and the years after, which were told in different tones. The before years with a warmth he was a little guarded about, the after years with a directness that she respected, because it was the directness of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has decided to set it down a few inches, just to see what happens. He had been engaged once, he told her, in late November, on a Sunday when the first hard frost had made the grass silver in the morning and the air tasted of iron and cedar. A woman named Priscilla, the daughter of a ranching family from Cedar Ridge. She had ended it when his parents died in close succession and he had, by his own account, become someone she had not agreed to. He said it without self-pity. He said it with the clear-eyed precision of a man who had looked at a thing long enough to understand it even if understanding it didn't help. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "I did become someone different." "Most people do when they lose everything at once," Ella said. "I didn't lose everything. I kept the land. I kept Pete, I kept Cisco. The things that do not require you to be emotionally available," she said gently. A long pause. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Is that how you see it?" he asked. Not defensive this time, genuinely asking. "I see a man who is very capable of loyalty and care and commitment," she said, "to the things and people he has decided are safe to be loyal and caring and committed to. That is not a flaw. It is a response to something." She looked at him steadily. "The question is only whether you ever want to expand the circle." He was quiet for a long time after that. The frostlight on the fields was very beautiful and very cold, and somewhere in the barn Cisco was singing something low in Spanish. "I don't know how to do that without," he stopped. "Without being in a position to be hurt," she said. "Yes." "Neither do I," she said, and the honesty of it was the thing that mattered, the frank admission that she was not offering him safety or certainty. She was just offering her own honest presence, and whatever was between them would be whatever it was. "But I think the alternative is a smaller life. And I don't think you want a smaller life. I think you want this land and everything that belongs on it, and I think you have been waiting for something you haven't let yourself believe in." He stood up from the chair and went to the porch railing and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the fields. Then he said, "Will you come to supper on Saturday?" She did not make it small or easy or perform uncertainty she didn't feel. She said, "Yes." Supper on Saturday was not elaborate. He was not a man of elaborate gestures, and she would not have trusted elaborate gestures from him. It was a good meal, simply made with fresh bread from the Widow Harmon's bakery in town, and a beef stew he had made himself with the serious, methodical attention he gave everything. Pete was at the table, which made everything easier. Cisco appeared briefly, and was introduced and grinned in a way that was entirely unsubtle about how pleased he was. They talked through supper and then sat by the fire afterward, and the conversation moved through things she would later not be able to fully recall but felt as a warmth. His plans for the ranch in the coming spring, her own ambitions for the shop. A long discussion about a book she had brought with her from Missouri that he had actually read too, which surprised them both and then, in retrospect, surprised neither of them. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the road again, lantern in hand, and at the gate he stopped and she turned and he said, "I would like to do this again." "Then you know where my shop is," she said, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was so clear and real that she felt it as a physical thing, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He came to the shop the following Wednesday, in the afternoon, without a mending project or any ostensible reason. He knocked on the door and came in and sat in the chair she kept for customers, and told her about the water rights dispute with the Hollies family in detail, because apparently he had been thinking about it and found himself wanting to talk through the logic of it, and she was the person he wanted to talk to. She kept sewing while he talked. She asked good questions. He stayed for 2 hours. He came back on Friday. By the end of November, the people of Dusty Creek had noticed something that seemed to them roughly equivalent to a meteor landing in a field. Theodore Carver was voluntarily spending time with a person. Margaret Prout was approximately beside herself with delighted restraint, which meant she said nothing directly to Ella, but did purchase an entire bolt of fabric she did not need as an excuse to visit the shop and try to read the situation, and was foiled by Ella's complete, cheerful composure. The water rights dispute boiled over in early December, when the Hollies family put in a dam along the upper creek that reduced the flow to the Carver land, and 2 neighboring ranches significantly enough to matter. Theodore rode to town and met with Sheriff Burke and 2 of the other affected ranchers, and Ella heard about it from Hector Prout and went to the meeting place, the back room of the hardware store, which was the unofficial civic meeting ground of Dusty Creek, not because she had been invited, but because she had a practical knowledge of Tennessee water law from having grown up next to a disputed creek, and she thought it might be relevant. She knocked on the door of the back room and Theodore opened it and looked at her with an expression that held no surprise and only a trace of something that might have been relief. "Come in," he said. She came in and said what she knew, which was that the territorial precedent on water rights in Texas, based on what she understood of common law, depended heavily on first appropriation claims, and that the original deed language of both properties would be the determining document. She said this plainly to the room, and the men in the room received it with varying degrees of openness, Sheriff Burke immediately, the other 2 ranchers after a moment's adjustment to the novelty of a woman speaking practical law in a hardware store back room, Theodore without any adjustment at all. "She's right," Theodore said. "I have the original deed. I've read it. The creek usage rights are explicitly included." The dispute was eventually resolved by a combination of Theodore's deed documentation, Sheriff Burke's firm intervention, and the implicit but clear suggestion from enough of the town's business community that the Hollies family would find commerce difficult if they continued on their current course. The dam came down before Christmas. It was not a violent resolution. It was a practical one, and Ella was quietly satisfied by this. Theodore came to find her after on the street outside the hardware store, and he said, with the characteristic directness that she had come to love, she recognized it in herself as love by this point, though she had not named it to him yet, "Thank you for coming in. I had useful information," she said. "You always do," he said, and his tone had something in it that was beyond the practical, and they stood on the main street of Dusty Creek in the December cold with the distance between them shrinking in a way that had nothing to do with proximity. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the edge of town, where the road opened up to the hills, and the cold was clean and sharp, and he said, without preamble, without any of the hesitation she might have expected from a man who had spent 3 years building walls, "I don't want to keep doing this in pieces." She waited. "I want you to know," he said, looking at the hills and then looking at her, "that I am not, I find this," he stopped, recollected himself, tried again. "I am not practiced at this. I am aware of that. But I know that the thing I have been most looking forward to in any given week for the last 6 weeks is whatever day you are going to appear on my porch or in my shop or in a hardware store meeting you were not technically invited to." She smiled. She could not help it. "I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give," he continued. "I know I am not easy. I know I have been." He made a gesture with his hand that encompassed the general state of him. "What I am. But I wanted you to know that whatever this is, I am in it with intention, not by accident." "Theodore," she said, and the use of his first name, which she had not done before, moved something in his face immediately. "I sat on your porch because I wanted to sit on your porch. I did not come to fix you or reach you or make you into something you are not. I came because you interested me, and because the view from your porch is genuinely beautiful, and because I thought you might be worth the patience." She paused. "You are worth the patience." He looked at her for a long moment, in the December cold, with everything open in his face for once, and then he reached out and took her hand with the care of a man who understands the weight of what he is doing, and she let him, and they stood like that for a while, looking at the hills, and she felt that something had closed into place. The first time he kissed her was 2 days before Christmas, on her porch, her own porch, on the east-facing house with the chair she had brought from the Prout storeroom. He had walked her home from a Christmas gathering at the church that she had persuaded him to attend, which had been, she noted privately, the first church social event he had appeared at in 3 years, and which had produced in the people of Dusty Creek a collective expression that was somewhere between joy and the vindication of a long bet. He had been stiff for the first hour and then gradually more himself. She had stood near him throughout but never managed him, never directed or performed or tried to make him be anything for the room, just let him be where he was, and he had been more present than she suspected he had expected to be. On her porch in the cold, with the stars overhead and the smell of wood smoke from chimneys all down the street, he had stopped and looked at her and said, very simply, "May I?" And she had said yes, and he had kissed her with the same quality he gave everything that mattered to him, complete, careful mint. She stood on her porch in the cold afterward and felt the stars and the dark and the particular absolute rightness of it, and thought, well, there it is. Christmas itself was spent, in a remarkable departure from his previous several Christmases, in the company of people. Pete Holloway was well enough to sit at the table for a proper meal, and Cisco's wife, a woman named Rosa who Ella met for the first time and liked immediately, came in from the small house they had taken near the creek road. The Prouts joined them, at Theodore's invitation, which had surprised Ella and moved her in a way she had not anticipated, because it spoke of a man making a decision to choose the larger life over the smaller one. Margaret Prout, who had the decency to confine her triumphant satisfaction to a single meaningful look at Ella across the table, was impeccable for the rest of the evening. The new year, 1879, brought changes that settled rather than disrupted. Ella's shop was the busiest it had been, with the post-holiday rush of women who had received fabric as gifts and wanted it made into things, and she hired a helper, a quiet, competent girl of 17 named Ruth Slade, the daughter of a local farmer, who was quick with her hands and learned well. The question of the shop's long-term location had also begun to resolve itself, because Hector Prout, with careful business instincts, had noted that a larger storefront was coming available on the main street and had mentioned to Ella that an expansion would be practical. She and Theodore had a conversation in late January about the future, not a formal conversation. They were not formal people, but the kind of conversation that happens over coffee and unfolds in the natural shape of two people who have decided to be honest about what they want. "I don't want you to give up the shop," he said. "I want to be clear about that." They were at his kitchen table, which had become in the last 2 months a kind of home base for conversations that mattered, the fire going, the hills visible through the window on the clear days, Pete occasionally audible from his room down the hall making a point of not eavesdropping. "I had no intention of giving up the shop," she said. "Some women in your position might." "Theodore," she said, I have been building that shop since before you kissed me on my porch. What exactly do you think would change?" He had the good grace to look both corrected and faintly pleased. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point I was making, apparently very badly." She had smiled at him, and he had smiled back, and the smile on Theodore Carver was, she had come to understand, one of the rarer and more beautiful things in the Texas Hill Country. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did it on a Sunday, on his porch, which was the only appropriate place, and he did it in the morning before the day had any other business to conduct, because he was a man who thought the most important things deserved to come first. He had made coffee. He had carried the cups out and sat down, and she had sat across from him in the familiar chair, and there had been a moment of the ordinary Sunday quiet between them, and then he had set his cup down and looked at her with everything steady in him the way it was when he had made a decision completely. "Ella," he said, "I want to marry you. I want you to be here. I want to watch you make things impossible to reach from that shop of yours, and I want to come home to you, and I want—" He stopped. "I want this to be the thing that doesn't go away." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him, at his face in the February morning light, all the containment and steadiness and hard-won openness of him, the thing she had not tried to reach but that had found her anyway here on this porch in this place that was becoming hers. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He breathed, she saw it, the whole body exhale of a man who had been bracing against something, and was now permitted to set it down, and he crossed the porch and pulled her to her feet, and held her with the full force of a man who had been careful for a very long time, and was no longer required to be, and she held him back with equal strength, and the cedar elms moved in the morning wind, and Pete Holloway, who had absolutely been listening from the window, went back to bed with an expression of complete peace. They were married in April of 1879. The wedding was in the small church in Dusty Creek, on a day when the bluebonnets were up along every roadside and the air smelled of warm grass and cedar, and the whole town came, which under ordinary circumstances would have made Theodore Carver feel hunted, but which under these circumstances he experienced with a kind of calm abundance, because she was next to him, and there was nothing in the world that was insufficient with her next to him. Ella wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored cotton, with a high collar and long sleeves, simple and beautifully fit, the kind of dress that would have been elegant in a much larger city, and was exactly right for a spring morning in a small Texas town. She wore her mother's earrings, small gold loops that she had carried from Tennessee to Missouri to Dusty Creek, and she walked down the aisle with her spine straight, and her eyes on Theodore's face with the same direct, unperformed clarity that had characterized everything about her from the day she'd arrived. He looked at her coming toward him like a man seeing something he had not known to believe in and was discovering in real time that it was real. Margaret Prout cried. Hector Prout reached over and took her hand, which was the most publicly demonstrative act of their long marriage, and which she received with a very small, private smile. Pete Holloway, seated in the front pew, had the look of a man who had arranged the whole thing through sheer willpower, which was not entirely wrong. Cisco Reyes sat beside his wife Rosa, and was the first person on his feet when the preacher said the final words, and Theodore kissed his bride with the complete, steady attention he gave everything that mattered to him most. They celebrated with a meal at the Prout house that moved outdoors as the afternoon warmed, and stayed there until the stars were fully out, and the voices of people who cared about them both wound around in the spring dark like something generous and permanent. The life they built had the shape of lives built by people who know themselves and each other well. Ella kept the shop and expanded it, as Hector had suggested, into the larger storefront on the main street, where she eventually employed Ruth Slade full-time and took on a second assistant named Helen, a widow of 30 who had come to Dusty Creek the way Ella herself had, with a trunk and a decision and a willingness to find out what came next. The shop became the best dressmaking and alterations establishment within 50 miles, and women came from Cedar Ridge and further for specific commissions. Theodore ran his ranch with the same methodical capability he always had, but with a quality to it now, a lightness, not carelessness, that Pete noticed first and remarked on to Cisco with the simple satisfaction of a man who has watched something come right. He expanded the cattle operation with careful timing, added a second water trough and a new fence line along the disputed creek boundary, and served on the County Cattlemen's Association with a productive regularity that would have been unrecognizable to the man he'd been 2 years earlier. He also, quietly and with a complete lack of performance about it, became more present in the town. Not in the performing himself way that had always felt impossible, but in the functional, honest way that came naturally once he had a reason to come to town that he loved. He stopped in at the hardware store because Jim Braddock was a fair man and worth knowing. He talked with Sheriff Burke about the things the county needed. He showed up, not in the way of a man trying to be seen, but in the way of a man who belongs somewhere and knows it. It was August of 1879 when Ella told him, on the porch in the evening after supper, that there was going to be a baby in the spring. She told him plainly, looking at him, her hands around a coffee cup, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had moved him more than he had words for immediately. Then he set down his own cup and reached over and took her hand and held it and looked at her with everything in his face, and she felt it, the full depth of what she had found here, in this man who could not be reached, who had found her instead. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am more than I know how to say," he said very quietly. "Then say it later," she said, "when you find the words." He did find the words that night, and in the days and weeks that followed, because it turned out that Theodore Carver, who had for 3 years been a man of very few personal words, had a great many of them stored up and waiting for someone worth saying them to. The baby was a boy, born in March of 1880 on a cold, bright morning with Dr. Fielding in attendance and Pete Holloway pacing the length of the front porch from one end to the other for 4 hours straight, which was not recommended for his heart, but which he could not help, and which Theodore, who was doing a similar thing from inside the house, lacked the moral authority to object to. They named him James Henry Carver, James for Ella's father, Henry for Theodore's. He was a solid, healthy baby who arrived with a very clear opinion of his surroundings and a voice to match, and who from his first weeks showed a temperament that was a remarkable combination of his parents', his mother's direct, observant calm and his father's intensity. Theodore held him in the first hour with the same careful completeness he brought to everything precious, looking down at this person who was both himself and Ella and something entirely new, and felt the last remaining walls come down with the finality of something that was no longer needed. Pete Holloway's heart continued to trouble him, but he lived 2 more years beyond the spring on the creek road, long enough to watch James take his first steps on the front porch, and to say, with absolute conviction, that this was the best thing he had personally contributed to in his 60-some years, by which he meant the whole complicated, unhurried sequence of things that had brought Ella to that porch and Theodore to the porch to find her. He died in the summer of 1882, quietly and in his own room, and they buried him on the Carver land as he had wanted, with a cedar post marker that Theodore cut himself. Cisco, Reyes, and Rosa stayed on the ranch through all of it and became, in the way of people who share years and work and children, for Rosa had 2 of her own, a boy and a girl, something closer than employees, and not quite family, but the particular thing between those words for which no formal language exists, and which everyone who has it understands. There was a second child, a girl this time, born in the autumn of 1882, the same year they lost Pete, which gave the grief and the joy of that season a particular quality. They named her Clara Margaret Clara for the Prout girl who had grown by now into a sensible young woman of 19, and Margaret for the woman who had, at a supper table in August of 1878, mentioned a name and asked a question that had started all of this. Margaret Prout received the news of this naming with a composure that lasted approximately 4 seconds before she had to excuse herself to find a handkerchief. The shop on the main street of Dusty Creek continued and grew. Ella worked fewer hours as the children were small, more hours as they grew old enough to come sit in the back room after school and do their letters at the work table while she finished hems and took measurements. James, who by the age of 6 had strong opinions about everything and a remarkable eye for detail, would sit and watch his mother work with the focused attention of a child who is absorbing a skill before they know they are absorbing it. Clara, who was quieter, who had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's precision, liked to sit under the work table and listen to the women talking and form her own very detailed views about everything she heard, which she shared selectively and without warning. Theodore came to the shop often. Not as a customer mostly, though the man could get through work clothes at a remarkable rate, and Ella's skill kept his shirts in better condition than they had ever been, but because the shop was where his wife was in the afternoons, and because he had found over the years that he liked being where she was. He would come in and sit in the customer chair and they would talk, or he would bring her coffee when she had been there since morning and forgotten to eat, or he would take the children home on his horse when the shop needed another 2 hours. The people of Dusty Creek watched this with the particular warmth that communities feel when something that was broken gets mended, when the thing they had given up on turns out to have been possible all along. Theodore Carver came to the 4th of July celebration in 1881 and stayed for the whole thing, which was noted and remembered by everyone who had been describing him as impossible to reach for 3 years. He stood with Ella in the firelight at the edge of the crowd, James asleep against his shoulder, and talked with Sheriff Burke and Jim Braddock and the 2 Apache traders he had gotten to know through a shared interest in Creek land management, and he was neither performing contentment nor pretending it. He simply was it. Ella watched him, across the crowd, and felt the same thing she had felt on that first Sunday on his porch, the recognition of something real. Except now it had years in it, depth and history and the accumulated specific weight of all the days they had lived, and it was so much more than what she had sat down to wait for, so much more than she had allowed herself to name, and she was grateful for it in a way that was not small or cautious or hedged. She was grateful the way the land is grateful for rain after a dry season, completely, without reservation, changed by it. He found her across the crowd the way he always found her, without seeming to look, and something in his expression across the distance said what his words would confirm later that night on their porch, with the fireworks over, and the children asleep and the Texas stars enormous overhead. That he was exactly where he wanted to be, in the life he had not expected to have, with the person who had not tried to reach him but had sat down and waited and let him find his own way to her. And that this was the thing he would not trade for anything the world might offer. "I have been thinking," he said on the porch in the dark, the way he often began his most important statements, not dramatically, just with the directness that was his most natural language. "What have you been thinking?" she said from her chair. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "That 3 years before you came," he said, "I was sitting on this porch every evening looking at those hills and thinking there was nothing missing. I had convinced myself very thoroughly that there was nothing missing." He paused. "I was wrong." She looked at him. The lantern between them threw its small circle of light, the same steady, unhurried light it had thrown every evening of their life together, and in it his face was everything she knew, the strong jaw, the gray-green eyes, the capacity for feeling that he had learned, slowly and willingly, not to be afraid of. "I know," she said. "You always know before I say it," he said, and his tone was not frustrated but fond, deeply and specifically fond, the way you are fond of a thing that has become so much a part of you that you cannot imagine the self that existed without it. "I've had practice," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the familiar way, the same way he had taken it on the road in December 3 years ago, the first time, The same weight and the same care, and they sat in the dark with the stars overhead and the hills dark and solid in the distance, and the house behind them full of sleeping children, and the porch between them and the world outside that was sometimes hard and sometimes unjust, and was always, underneath everything, the thing you worked with your whole self to make into something good. James grew up on that ranch, learning horses and cattle, and the patience to look at a problem long enough to see its real shape. He had his mother's way with people and his father's way with land, which was a combination that would serve him well in all the years that lay ahead of him. Clara grew up between the shop and the ranch, between needles and horses, and eventually chose both. And the shop that Ella had built from a single rented storefront passed into her hands with the same care with which it had been made. The years in Dusty Creek turned over in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, not without the kind of loss that comes to everyone eventually, but with the sustained, deep quality of a life that has found its right shape. The land held. The shop held. The marriage held in the way that marriages hold when they are built on honest ground by people who chose each other not for performance or need, but for the real, specific, irreducible quality of the person they found. And the porch held, through all of it. The rocking chair on the far end, worn smooth by years of use, still faced the hills. The cedar elms grew taller. The views stayed the same in the way that Texas hill country views stay the same, not unchanged, because nothing is unchanged, but constant in their essential character. The long hills going blue at the horizon, and the sky above them enormous and very clear, and the smoke from the chimney in the evenings, and the smell of coffee in the mornings, and 2 cups on the railing in the years when the children had grown, and the house was quieter, and the porch was again just for the 2 of them. He still found her there on the Sunday afternoons. She still sat in the chair with her hands at rest and her face turned toward the hills. The reaching had never been the point. The sitting still and being present and trusting that real things find their own way, that had always been the point, and it still was, and the proof of it was in everything around them. In the solid, unbroken fact of their life together, in the land that held and the children that grew and the town that knew them, in the 31 years of quiet Sunday mornings and the cup always ready, in the man who had been described as impossible to reach and had simply, when the time was right, found his way home.